the ability to transmit horrible information across the world unless we really find a way to make there be a cost for allowing the teaching of hate.
Let me just add, we'll be spending a lot of time, I think, on the education and how we do that. The other thing it's occurred to me in terms of this concept of this monolithic Jew, and that I think is really the reason that those questions do, in fact, tend to identify anti-Semitic behavior, is that when you look at the reality of it, we got a lot of individuals who do a lot of different things. I really love reading the articles about the two bankers, two bank CEOs, both of them are Jewish, were going at each other, don't agree on anything, and go after each other. And because I think when you get into the real world, everybody is an individual. And all these people who that statement tends to bring together. And part of the celebrating diversity, I think, is that we ought to start getting used to the idea of celebrating differences, celebrating different views, particularly different views that we have among ourselves. One of the concerns I have, I was thinking about this as we were preparing, is that I think that sometimes there tends to be some pressure on Jews to support Israeli policies, for example. And I think that may tend to reinforce this concept that the Jews sort of think the same way we're the monolith. Where in fact, I think that if you were to do it privately, if you weren't to ask people to publicly say what their view is, a lot of people would say that the Israeli policies with respect to the Palestinian areas are wrong, or the Israeli policies on destroying the homes of family members of people who've committed terrorist acts, and not destroying the homes of family members of Jewish folks who've committed acts like that, is wrong. But I think it's very difficult sometimes to make those statements publicly. And I think that we ought to feel more encouraged to be able to share our diverse views, because I think ultimately that ends up being to our benefit, frankly. But that may still be a minority.
Well, that really touches a chord with me, right? Because as you heard in the mission statement, right, I'm part of an organization of 1,800 rabbis who, in this country, who are not all reform and not all lefty crazies, who publicly criticize Israeli policy vis-a-vis Palestinians. And, I hope I can say this. I feel very blessed to be in a congregation that hopefully, won't fire me for making those kinds of statements. But it is not easy to be a Jewish leader and to stray from, what you see as the mainstream Jewish take on Israel. It's very hard. And I'll just stop there. There's more to it.
And also, there are rabbis who have told me that they get a tremendous amount of pressure from their congregants with respect to taking positions where there are nuances, but to not express the nuances. And so I think this is something that we perhaps could work on.
I guess this is what I wanted to add. I think, unfortunately, we're justified as Jews in being afraid of anti-Semitism. And I'm afraid of it. I mean, and when our congregation over the summer had some vandalism occur, and we had to figure out, was that anti-Semitism? That's sort of another question. And that, the fear is there, and it's real, and it's justified. But unfortunately, what happens then is, because of that fear is what then turns into this pressure to toe a certain line on Israel. Because Israel is seen as the solution to anti-Semitism. And so if I criticize Israeli policy, then I'm opening up my people to being attacked or killed or annihilated. I mean, I think it really does. When I start to, if I criticize an Israeli policy, it can easily, in some people's minds, get blown up into, oh, she's saying Israel shouldn't exist. or she's against Israel, and then immediately, well, she's an anti-Semite. You know, if you Google me, I don't know if it's still up there. Last time I was looking for a job, it was there, and I was worried. If you Google me or my father or many of these 1800 rabbis, you'll find that we are on blacklists of anti-Semitic rabbis, self-hating Jewish rabbis. So those things are linked in a very unhealthy way.
Probably not much comfort, but I'll tell you a lot of folks with the ACLU are as well. And then look at some of the most racist right-wing websites. And they point out, for example,
these are Jewish websites.
Yeah, but maybe, again, maybe this perspective is that we really need to teach them that, yeah, it's important to be able to have that diversity of views, because ultimately that is in our better interest than, that this, again, the idea of monolithic support for Israel. Yeah.
So, not prepared for this, but this is a very interesting discussion, and I think it's really worthwhile. Yeah. I think two Jews, three opinions. I don't think this is new, and I don't think this is anything we have to shy away from. And I'm not a rabbi. It's hard to hear that good Jewish people who clearly support Israel, who may have a criticism of a particular policy, are being criticized for that. That's unfortunate, and we should be better. We always try to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we should really try to do that. I think what happens is partially what Rabbi said. There are a lot of reasons, not so much for us personally to be afraid. I mean, God knows we're more of a target even in our country than we'd like to be. But that's not Israel. Israel is clearly a target for destruction by most of the countries around it, and by hundreds of millions of people who are taught, even if they're lucky enough not to be taught that all Jews are equally bad, they are clearly taught that Israel is an interloper and there is no right to a Jewish presence there. So that I think helps to explain why sometimes people react irrationally and inappropriately to someone taking a position against a particular policy. God knows, people in Israel are critical of every Israeli policy. People in our country who love Israel have every right, as we do to be critical of our country, to be critical of the country that we care about in the Jewish homeland, and is the Jewish homeland, when we think they're doing something inappropriate or wrong. So I guess the thing that we need to try to keep in mind is that we need to help people who are legitimately afraid to understand that when we speak out against something, that it's in the context of love for Israel and support for Israel, and maybe just as importantly, a recognition that these things that we speak out against aren't the reason there's no peace in the Middle East. That's, I think, a really important thing. The reason there is no peace for Israel is because too many people hate it. And too many people feel that it's in their interest to destroy or hurt Israel than it is to help their own people. If we could try to put those two concepts together, then I think even the people who are inappropriately concerned about any particular criticism would at least understand the context in which it was being offered. And I know that's hard because it's a complicated subject to bring every time, and we have to be able to criticize when we think Israel does something wrong. But maybe that's what we have to understand, that the consequence of the problem that Israel is doing wrong is not the reason for the problem in the Middle East. If we keep that in mind, I think it may be easier for people in the East, because we have a moral obligation to say when we think something's wrong. That's who we are as Jews. We can't abandon that. Listen, my wife is amazing. She's not perfect all the time. But I love her, and I support her, and God forbid anyone's going to come to kill her. I'm not going to say, well, my wife's not perfect. I don't like what she did here, and that's a justification for not supporting. That's the way I think we need to help people to understand.
Okay, moving on. So let me ask the question: how in what ways is anti-Semitism different in this country from other forms of bigotry? Any immediate thoughts?
I don't know if it's just in this country, but you know, all horizontal identities. This is a new phrase that I just learned, right? All kind of differences that are shared among a certain group, right? Can be targets of hate and prejudice and bigotry. And you know, I think anti-Semitism, the experience of anti-Semitism, has similarities to the experiences of racism, but you can't ever say that they're the same, you know. And I think right now, in this moment, what really differentiates the experience of anti-Semitism is the existence of Israel. The existence of a Jewish state kind of raises the stakes and creates a bigger gray area in terms of, you know, is this statement against the state of Israel, or is it anti-Semitic? And trying to discern that. And I think that's something that really differentiates anti-Semitism from other group, you know, experiences.
I would just add very, very briefly, I agree with what the Rabbi said, absolutely. I think, you know, if you ask the same question about racism, if you ask the same question about homophobia, there are differences and commonalities, I mean, there's no question about it, but focusing specifically on anti-Semitism, one of the things that I see that I find troubling, and if you take a look at this little Connecticut press release that we did, very often when people are prejudiced against Jews, it goes to the extreme very quickly. We have incidents of school-age children saying to other Jewish school-age children, when I grow up, I'm going to finish the job that Hitler started. And I don't want to get carried. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens every year. We hear a couple of instances like that. That's not the kind of thing you typically hear in the context of other kinds of equally horrible isms, bigotry. And that's something that I find troubling, that does distinguish us a little bit.
I have more on this, but let's flip over and get right into how we address these kinds of attitudes, particularly in schools. And let me preface it by saying that just as sort of as a background, I described before the concept of the First Amendment, and I want to make clear that when you're dealing with certain populations, including schools, the standards are slightly different. There is more restriction allowed with schools, with military, with prisons, because there's a concept that there's a compelling interest in what I would prefer to call control, but disruption is the way it's put. Nonetheless, students have First Amendment rights, including rights to speech, to free speech. But there are means of restricting it. I would suggest, however, that policy-wise, I think it is still the better policy to encourage not preventing people from saying the evil thing that's on their mind, but teaching how you overcome that, because I think ultimately that's where the solution lies. But I will tell you that the ACLU gets a lot of grief about that from a lot of organizations and parents that want to protect their kids, and understandably. But we think that ultimately it's a better solution. But I want to really turn it over to Gary. You can talk about sort of what ADL is doing and sort of what are the approaches that have worked better.
As Andy talked about with the ACLU, we believe that the best response to bad speech is better speech. And taking that towards the school system, what ADL has developed over time is a pretty sophisticated series of education programs. We are actually in Connecticut the largest non-governmental provider of education services. And these programs are designed to promote a respect for diversity, to combat bigotry, and to combat bullying. We are very, very well accepted across the state in terms of the providing of these services, and we have some really very, very good results. Believe me, it's not a cure-all, because there is no cure-all, but I'll give you a quick story of what happened in a school, high school in the Hartford area that had the benefit of our programs. And everything that these education programs do can be, I think, can be understood in this one sentence. What these try to do is to try to turn bystanders into allies. And when that happens, in any context, but most specifically in the school context, that makes all the difference in the world. And so there was a student, happened to be a Jewish student, but for this example, but this works for any kind of scenario, who was in a group of kids, and suddenly one of the kids started saying some really nasty anti-Semitic stuff to him, out of nowhere. And you can imagine when someone's the victim of any kind of prejudice or bigotry, how isolated and alone you feel. You feel like the whole world is falling apart, you don't know what to do. This school happened to be one of the schools that ADL regularly does its programs, and the kids knew what to do. And that changed everything. The kids stood up and went between the person who was the perpetrator and the person who was the victim, and they said to the perpetrator, "We don't talk this way in this school. What's wrong with you? You know, you better cut this out right now." Then they also went to the assistant principal and explained what happened. And so everyone did what you want someone to do when someone is being victimized. And so the feeling for this particular kid was no longer isolated and alone. He felt that the school had his back, and although no one wants to be the victim of prejudice, it changed everything. The school dealt with the kid appropriately, the kids did the right thing, and again, that made all the difference. And that's the key to schools, but that's the key to everywhere. When there is a problem, when you hear a bigoted statement, we need to stand up, all of us, and say, this is America, we don't accept this kind of stuff here. Or however you want to say it. But that's really the obligation that can make everything better.
Just to add to that, we all know, those of us who have kids all know that the kids listen to their friends at a certain age more than they're going to listen probably to us, or at least they'll indicate it more. They actually do listen to us, I'm sure. But one of the problems with simply prohibiting speech is that these kids are getting it at home for the most part. And you simply have somebody not talk about it, they're going to continue to hear it, they're going to continue to believe it, they're going to continue to act on it as they grow into adults. So what's great about this is the idea of fighting speech with speech, educating folks, and having it out there really works not only in terms of stopping it in its tracks, but perhaps even reversing it and having a long-term impact.
I just have a question, just a follow-up, which is, I sometimes worry about, especially in childhood, someone being profiled as a bully or as a perpetrator and kind of put in that box with that label. And I don't know enough about this world. I'm curious what a school or a community does to actually I would say emotionally support the perpetrator, right? Help that person, because I can't imagine that isolating that person is going to make them not want to do it again, right? So how do you, what's a healthy response there?
It's a great question without a definitive answer. But, I mean, I would encourage anyone to pick up my card and send me an email, and I'll let you know when there's going to be one of these school programs in the area. We do hundreds of school programs a year across the state, many of which are smaller and it's not appropriate for visitors. But for instance, in Old Line, we do a bigger assembly program, which it is okay for a few adults to gather and witness. One of the things, though, just to follow up on the rabbi's question, in real life, it's rare that someone is only a bully, someone is only a victim, or someone is only a bystander. Because we're not perfect. And one of the things that these programs, and by the way, we all have students telling their own stories to students, which makes it much easier for the kids to talk what's happening in the school environment. So mostly it's helping the kids to identify their different roles in different circumstances so they can try to be a little more personally aware of what they're doing and therefore a little bit more considerate in terms of how they're handling situations. There are times, unfortunately, though, when it's not, I mean, the behavior is excessive and it's repetitive and it's nasty, then schools have ways to deal with those kinds of kids, and sometimes those kids shouldn't be. I mean, for instance, the kid the story I told you about, he was given another chance, and he was, they worked hard to provide some education. It didn't stick, and you can't have an environment where there's some kid who's going out of his way to be really obstreperous and difficult. But the point is, that's rare, I think, Rabbi. I think most of us have it all in us sometime, and the hope is we can be more mindful of what we do, the impact. One of the things that's really cool about these assemblies is after the students give their presentation, or 4 or 5, and talk about their experience at school, there's an open mic session. Kids come up and say unbelievable things. It's like sometimes you want to put your hands in your ears. But you do get fairly regularly someone saying, I've been treating this person horribly for 2 years now. And I didn't really understand the consequence of what I was doing. And I do now, and I'm not going to do it anymore. And you hear that, and the kids go crazy, because everyone likes when someone recognizes that they made a mistake and want to do better. That's so empowering for the community. So,
why don't I open it up for questions, and we can come back to some of ours. Yes?
Just want to throw something out and get your response about attitudes among Jews regarding anti-Semitism. I really think there's a major generational aspect to it. If I ask my children or grandchildren, have they been aware or impacted by anti-Semitic remarks or innuendos, they universally say no. If I ask contemporaries of mine, they are really naysayers. The incidence of anti-Semitism is increasing. They continuously point out what's going on in Europe. They continuously point out the fact that university campuses are allowing people of markedly different opinions to speak on campus, and they vigorously oppose that. The issue of they're much more supportive of Israel, than the younger, population. They've not been impacted by anti-Semitism. What is your take on all of this? I'm optimistic. I just hope that these kids grow up quickly and dominate society. So maybe some of these things will quiet down.
Let me let Gary respond. I know Gary's told me that the incidence in Connecticut actually is up, and I know if you've read the papers recently, I know in West Hartford, for example, there was a major set of incidents. There have been around, people in this congregation have told me that their kids have been subjected to anti-Semitic comments. And so I think it's out there, but I think that one of the things that's happened is a lot of us, I know, speaking from someone who's spent a lot of time in West Hartford, growing up and then raising my family there. When you're living in a community that is among a lot of Jews, it probably tends to be somewhat less than in some of the other communities. But Gary, I'm sure, has a lot more things.
I disagree with one point that you made based on what I've been seeing in the last few years. I may have agreed with you 10 years ago. What we're seeing is that our high school age kids, especially, and even more than that, our college age kids, are increasingly experiencing things that my generation did not experience. So clearly when you go a generation or two above me, they saw the worst the world has ever offered. We had a couple of generations, including my own, where, frankly, I never felt isolated or alone as a Jew. Even when I went to my high school, which only had my sister and me as the two Jews in the high school. I never felt it. If you talk to kids, high school age kids now and college age kids who are committed Jews, especially, they don't feel as comfortable as I do. And that's, and in fact, I do a whole little talk about what you should know about what your parents and, what your children and grandchildren are experiencing. It's a much more complicated world for them, I think, than it was for us. Because I agree with everything else you said about that, but I think we need to know that our kids are having more stress in a lot of respects than we did.
I disagree with that idea. Years ago, when I was a young man, you went to certain colleges, I am amazed now that children go to Harvard, Jews go to Harvard and Yale, and I don't know how welcome they are, but they're there. You knew to stay out of different employment. Since I wasn't a particularly smart kid, I went to a city college. I wouldn't even bother to apply to Yale or Harvard or any of those others. Now, in fact, even worse, when I had to move to Connecticut, I was really afraid to cross the boundary across the Bronx. The only reason that I moved up here, and I did cross the boundary, was because my wife, who is perfect.
No question there.
No question about that. She had crossed so many boundaries before that I felt that I just couldn't not do this. We also moved up at a time when there were still church obligations in Connecticut. A lot of church property, or property that you had to belong to a particular church. I believe that's about 20 years ago it ended. All of those have been, Connecticut had we moved up 50 years ago, and Connecticut had just passed a fair housing law. I think, to be honest, I think anti-Semitism has gone down a great deal. To me, I feel very comfortable walking around in Connecticut, even among the Gentiles.
God bless the Gentiles.
What I noticed is, I guess, Gary, you and I are probably in the same generation, more or less, and I also didn't grow up with overt anti-Semitism and was one of few Jewish kids in my community. But what I've seen is that Henry, maybe you're not seeing it because you're not in school.
No.
And the face of it has changed, and the way it's expressed has changed. The way I feel it these days is this whole war on Christmas idea. The bumper stickers, about, I don't have any problem with putting Christ back in Christmas for Christians, but there are messages that kids seem to be getting that then they're feeding to Jewish kids in school or using as ammunition against Jewish kids. I hate people who don't celebrate Christmas kind of stuff. So it's centered around, it seems to me that this war against, the culture war about, Christmas is no longer religious. I have no problem with making it more religious, but it's being blamed on Jews. So that's, yeah. Right, or anyone who would want to say at this time of year, Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, and the effort to say, no, just you say Merry Christmas. It's a more subtle form that I'm seeing our kids experiencing at school. So,
What about all the signs in that?
Yeah.
Perhaps this is not the right question to ask, but how do you account for some of for a lot of the anti-Semitism that's going on in Europe? And I will just explain one thing. My children were coming home from Israel, and they stopped in France. And my new grandson is a soldier, and he had a yarmulke on. And someone came up to him and said, "Excuse me, but do you speak Hebrew?" And he said, "Yes." They said, "Well, don't speak it here. Don't get off the plane with that yarmulke, because it's dangerous. Stay right where you are." And I thought that was very sad.
What'd she say?
What she said is her grandson.
Yeah.
Her grandson was coming back from Israel wearing a yarmulke that landed in France, and he was warned not to leave the plane with his yarmulke on.
Was he warned or was he threatened?
No, he was warned. He said it's not a good
It's
idea.
against the law there.
No, it is.
No. We've been focusing on some of the concerns we have in our country, which are real, but the rest of the world, and again, take a look at that survey, is really pretty treacherous. It is in France and other parts of Europe a major show of guts to be openly clear as a Jewish person, and it's a very, very disconcerting thing. There are a lot of reasons for it, which take too long to go into today, but one of the major issues is that there are a lot of folks in Europe who, again, have been taught to hate, really taught to hate in a very, very serious way, and don't have any compunction against acting on that hate.
I would like to say, as an Israeli soldier, I can't even tell you what he told me.
I'd like to add that my son was told the same thing when he went to college in Boston about wearing his Yankee hat.
So I have a story that speaks to what you just said. I was looking up the Israeli news the other day, and it was very concerning to me to see that just last month, towards the very end of the month at Temple Mount, there was a sermon, and It shows it clear on the YouTube video. I don't know if you've seen it. Brings tears to my eyes. That here at Temple Mount, at this holy space where Muslims are worship, there was a Muslim, and there were children and all other Muslims around, and this I guess he was a minister, I don't know what you call a Muslim. He was giving a sermon about how we need to kill the Jews, slay them. It scared me, and the children, and they were all praying to Allah for this. It is very concerning to me. And I thought to myself, wow, I was just there, just last month. And this is what's happening right there. And it's being taught to children. How scary is that? So.
Georgia.
It's almost I just want to make a statement. So nothing can be taken out of historical context. So when we applaud, rightfully, our Constitution, we have to remember that it excluded Indians, blacks, and women. Just so we know this. But what got me to this week's Parsha is about Joseph's being incarcerated by his brothers, nearly killed. And it's about projection. It's about hate that stems, and I think all hate stems initially in the family. And because it's not appropriate and dangerous to the infant to express it within the family, it's projected outside. So it's also a coincidence, but not necessarily so, that Adam Lanza shot and stabbed his mother, which to me is the source of his hate before enacting this psychiatric dysfunction on the community. And so I really think that when times are difficult, as they are in Europe right now, that people cannot blame themselves or their families, and they have to go out and search for a scapegoat.